Hello everyone, thank you for joining me. Welcome to this episode of the monthly collaboration series for January 2023. This month we are examining what could be called the lower levels of the samurai class. What or who were the Jizamurai of Sengoku period Japan? That is the question I will be tackling in this video. I will provide a brief introduction to this important group in the course of Sengoku history. The playlist for this year's videos by myself and other creators will be linked in the description and pinned comment. At the time of recording, Anthony Cummins of the Samurai and Ninja History channel has a video about the Yoriki and Doshin, and Nick of the Shogunate channel has one about Ronin, which Anthony did a reply to. So please go and check those out. And while you are there, please check out their channels. I will link those videos in the pinned comment as well. Also, sources for this video will be listed in the description. So, now on to the Jizamurai. The term Jizamurai means something along the lines of samurai of the land or samurai of the soil. This is one of a number of terms used to talk about the middle and upper levels of rural society. Despite society seeming to be hierarchical, and it was, there was still a good deal of gray areas and some degree of social mobility. So it is important to keep in mind that, especially in the Sengoku period, what we today call samurai was by no means a clear-cut, well-defined group. Some have called Jizamurai a rural warrior gentry or yeomanry. They lived out in the villages and were among a number of local landholders. During the 15th and 16th centuries, rural society was undergoing dramatic change. The old estate system, the shoen, continued to wither and erode away. There is debate as to when one can say the shoen was completely dead, and it depended on locale, with shoen holding out longer in western and central Japan than they did in the east. In their place, the village was increasingly growing in prominence as the new focal point for local rural society. Throughout the 13th and 14th centuries, the economy of Japan in general took an upturn. Among other reasons, new forms of rice were introduced, which produced higher yields and were more resilient. In addition, a general trend of warming increased crop yields overall. The clearing of land into farmland also increased, which produced higher yields of rice and other crops as well. There was also a growing use of cash to pay for goods and services. Increased economic prosperity allowed some local farmers to own land and accrue wealth more so than was previously possible. A class called Myōshū grew in the early decades of the Muromachi period, which was 1336 to 1573. These were wealthy landholders and leaders of local village society. In some regions, the Jizamurai were considered to be part of the Myōshū. It is not surprising that some places the Jizamurai would be considered part of the Myōshū. Distinguishing between the two can be rather tricky. In fact, they were often essentially the same. Many Jizamurai had come from the wealthier Myōshū class originally. The main difference being that the Jizamurai claimed what could be called samurai status. The origin of many Jizamurai families were armed Myōshū who made relationships with Daimyō or Kokujin as a retainer. This meant they supposedly owed military service and also a portion of their income to the lord. I know the use of the term lord is questionable, and there is debate over it. However, for simplicity, I will be using it in this video. Kokujin were powerful, semi-autonomous, and autonomous provincial warriors. The term means men of the provinces. These were warriors who owned and controlled larger areas that could include multiple villages, but they were not what would be classified as daimyo. My master's capstone was mainly about how war influenced the rise of what are called the Kokujin lords in the 14th century. Although these Jizamurai had this retainer relationship with a more powerful lord, do not confuse that with their loyalty being absolute, nor with them being completely subservient. The Jizamurai usually did this in order to have someone more powerful than them confirming their land holdings and to protect those holdings, as well as to gain privileges. However, a Jizamurai could switch sides when they thought they could get a better deal, or when they thought they were backing the losing side, or they could go against their lord if their interests did not align. Loyalty and service in the Sengoku period in general was very conditional. It is a bit of a paradox that while they were part of this retainer relationship, many Jizamurai through the early decades of the Sengoku period were fiercely independent, and resisted their nominal lord's interference in the administration of their lands. The Jizamurai were residents of the villages. Often, Jizamurai would not own a full village. Rather, they would own a farm or farms within that village. This meant it was common for multiple Jizamurai to reside in the same village. The smaller Jizamurai commonly had to work the land for themselves. Other Jizamurai, though, had servants to work the land for them, or at least to assist in working the land. Some also had tenant farmers. Sometimes peasants' plots of land were not enough to sustain themselves, so they would also work on a Jizamurai's land. The Jizamurai would charge part of the yield, the monetary equivalent of the portion of the yield, or a mixture of both, as rent for the land the farmers worked. In addition to farming, some Jizamurai also ran manufacturing operations. Items such as ceramics and silk, among many others, might also be produced on the Jizamurai's land to increase their income. In addition to working the land, servants and tenant farmers also served as ashigaru, foot soldiers, under the command of the Jizamurai in times of war. We will come back to a related topic to this briefly. Along with the wealthier segments of the villagers, Jizamurai were among the leaders of rural society. It was not uncommon during much of the Sengoku period for them to identify more with the residents of the village and their interests than those of their lord. During rural uprisings, the Jizamurai often acted as commanders of the Iki forces. Iki, most often translated as leagues, were formed from individuals and groups organizing together around shared interests. In this period, for villagers, these interests often revolved around the access to resources and mutual defense of the village. Some Iki were Jizamurai, some were so-called peasants, and many were mixed. Possibly the most famous example of this was Oda Nobunaga's attempts to take control of Iga province. A lot has been made in pop culture about this having something to do with the so-called ninja. In reality, Iga was a region that had a long history of being independent and resisting centralization. As Nobunaga moved to seize the province, it was a network of Iki, of Jizamurai and peasants that stood against him. The existence of one kind of Iki did not mean another could not exist. Thus, in villages, you might have a mixed Iki and a peasant Iki. And membership in the mixed Iki did not exclude membership in the peasant one. Relationships and all this sort of stuff was very complex, and in rural society, often they were more horizontal than vertical. Iki could also have been between villages. Iki is a topic I plan to cover further in the future. Part of mutual defense included when villages fought each other. Yes, one thing not often talked about is that villages would sometimes fight each other in skirmishes over things to rights to use resources, such as water and lumber. The military strength of these village Iki was largely based on the Jizamurai's ability to train and mobilize the villagers. Another image that needs to be gotten rid of is the idea of unarmed, untrained, helpless villagers at the mercy of anyone trying to push them around. While there certainly were such instances of this was not the case with all villagers in all the villages. As mentioned, some also served as ashigaru, so having armed and trained, experienced soldiers in the village was a common occurrence. Despite this sense of shared interest that often existed, there was a complex relationship between the Jizamurai and villagers in many instances. Just as the Jizamurai resisted the influence of their lord, if they had one, or outside influences controlling how they administered their lands, the villagers also resisted Jizamurai interference in how they did things. As time progressed, attempts to reduce the Jizamurai influence increased. At times, those same peasant Iki would rise up against the Jizamurai, pressing their demands through threats of action or through carrying out actions. This was exacerbated by Kokujin and Daimyō kind of undermining their own subordinate Jizamurai by encouraging people like the Myoshu to have a greater influence on village matters. The reason for this was, as they expanded and consolidated their power, the Jizamurai remained a threat that would have to be dealt with one way or another. Even the ones that were retainers often had fickle tendencies and were more concerned about their own interests. While the military strength of one Jizamurai was nothing that would concern someone with the power of, say, a daimyo, when they banded together, they could sometimes put up a strong resistance, and even sometimes be successful. In addition, As the late 16th century came and the bid for the hegemony of Japan was about to take place, it was in the interest of powerful lords to pry the Jizamurai away from their entrenched, landed, semi-independent power bases in the villages and bring them further under their own control. The administration of the village as an entity was left to the Myōshū and other village elites, as opposed to multiple Jizamurai administering their own plots of land separately, and the Myōshū handling affairs outside of those lands. Over time, the interests and mutual concerns once shared became increasingly stretched and strained. As the 16th century was coming to a close and the peace of the Edo period was on the horizon, a high portion of the once royal Jizamurai owning their own land and running it directly had become vassals of powerful Daimyō, spending more time in castle towns and other urban centers away from their lands. As we have seen, this was a trend that already existed. Most of the Jizamurai were given the same options as the Ashigaru in the early Edo period: either remain in service to their lord or return to being farmers. Rather than drawing rents directly, the revenues went to their lord, and they now drew a stipend from a portion of that revenue, a portion of it being kept by their lord as a tax. Throughout the Edo period, there remained country samurai living out in the villages and such, but their status was diminished, and they were seen as rustic simpletons, and the urban samurai were seen as more cultured and sophisticated. This was a very quick overview of the Jizamurai, mostly of the Sengoku period. During this period, while they may have been considered lower-class samurai, they played an important role in the unfolding of the Sengoku period. They were also the bulk of what we would call the samurai class during that period. Many learn about the famous warlords and generals of the period, but the Jizamurai were no less important. A special thank you to my Patreon member Coulter Nebel for their kind support in joining. If you are interested, my Patreon link will be in the description under the channel links section. If you have made it to the end of this video here, I want to give you a massive thank you. I appreciate you giving me your time. I hope that you've enjoyed this video and found it informative. If so, please consider leaving a like, commenting, sharing, and possibly subscribing. Links to social media are in the description. I hope you have a wonderful day wherever you are, and I hope to see you in the next video. Until then, please take care. お疲れ様でした。